Okay, if everybody wants to have a seat and start eating your lunch, we will get started with the programming. I'm Heather Ramirez, and I am the current board chair at Axe Housing, and I'm also an adjunct professor here at Marquette Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today, and it's really great to see so many familiar faces in this crowd. Thank you for your interest in learning more about affordable homeownership here in Milwaukee and how Axe and its partners are working hard to increase access and reduce barriers in the city of Milwaukee. I joined the Axe board in 2020, and in just the past 2 years, Axe has helped over 600 families become new homeowners here in Milwaukee. We are working with community partners, residents, and local government leaders to reduce these barriers and reach more families so more families can start their lives in homes with safe and stable lives. So thank you again for joining us today. I am very excited to welcome our MC for today, Shannon Sims. Shannon Sims is a news anchor at today's WTMJ4. She is a longtime friend of Axe. She actually was the MC of our first ever longest neighborhood table event back in 2016. So thank you to Shannon, and I'll welcome you up to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Heather, for that introduction. It is really incredible that I can say I remember Axe back when it was like a really best kept secret. And if you haven't done the bus tour, get on board, because that is where you will really see how Axe is changing lives here in Milwaukee and the impact that they've made. Now, both as a journalist and a person who lives in Milwaukee, works in Milwaukee, I have seen over the past 10 years and reported on the decrease of home ownership, the rates of home ownership, the gap between African Americans and white families here in our city. And it really was surprising to me to learn of investor predator lending, or investor predators coming into the city of Milwaukee, getting homes, making it hard for those who could actually live and work here in Milwaukee. It is my pleasure now to invite our keynote speaker for the afternoon, John Johnson, to the stage. John Johnson is a research fellow here at Marquette Law School's Lumbar Center for the Public Policy Research and Civic Education. He's a quantitative social scientist whose research on the home ownership gap was first published in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel back in January of 2020. In that article, which was co-authored by Mike Goucher, he has continued to moderate, research, and publish data related to Milwaukee's housing market over the last several years. His latest findings appeared in the Journal-Sentinel on November of 2022. And without further ado, I ask that John Johnson and you give him a warm welcome as he comes to talk to us today.
Hey, everybody. It's great to see you all here today. Thanks for coming out, and we appreciate your interest in this important topic. Let's see. So today, in the next few minutes, I'm going to describe to you what I see as the two phases Milwaukee's housing market has gone through since the housing crisis began in around 2006. From 2006 to 2018, homeownership plummeted in the city, and then there was an inflection point around the year 2018. Since then, homeownership has begun to recover, but in both periods, out-of-state investment soared. It grew while homeownership was shrinking, and it's continued to grow at the same or even a greater pace in the last few years. But looking under the hood, we see that the kinds of buyers and sellers have changed in an important way. These two graphs really capture the meat of what I'm talking about. So on the left, you see the share of houses in Milwaukee that are owned by their occupier. This is a good point to say that today I'm talking about single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, and condominiums, the kind of place a family might buy to live in, even if they have another tenant there, possibly. We're not talking about apartment buildings that have 4 or more units today. During the 1990s and the first half of the aughts, a stable 79 to 80% of houses in the city were owner-occupied. But beginning in 2006, that started falling. It fell by 1 percentage point of the city's housing stock per year for an entire decade. And then it continued falling somewhat until about 2018. In total, the city lost a net of 15,000 owner-occupied houses. That's 12 percentage points of the entire housing stock. Then in 2018, we saw the beginnings of a recovery. Since then, we've added 3,000 owner-occupiers, that's again in net, which is 2 percentage points of the city's housing stock. Now, the other half of this story is the graph you see on the right. This is the number of houses that are owned by a landlord based outside of Wisconsin. So you can see it didn't really change. It was very, very low during the 90s and early aughts. And then, when the housing crisis started, it began growing. To be clear, this does not include properties owned by banks. This is properties owned by landlords. It's grown every year, and it hasn't changed. That growth trajectory hasn't changed at all, even as owner occupancy began to recover. There are almost 2,000 more properties owned by an out-of-state investor now than there were in 2018. About 1 in 6 of the city's rental houses are owned by an out-of-state landlord. This set of graphs shows the annual net change in the number of houses owned by different kinds of owners over this period. So in the top left, you see the annual change in the number of owner-occupied houses in the city. Those 13 red downward sloping bars are the housing crisis. You can see that in the worst year was actually 2012, when about 2,400 houses exited home ownership in the city. And you can also see the inflection point that occurs in 2018, where suddenly we have a black bar again. We have growth in that category, and the growth has increased every year since then. That's also about when the inflection point happens for landlords based in the city of Milwaukee and landlords based in the suburbs. But you'll notice that ownership by out-of-state landlords has continued to grow. So to get to the bottom of that, I took electronic versions of deeds filed with the Department of Revenue and matched them with parcel records so that I could identify the ownership status of every property before it was sold and after it was sold. That's what this rather complicated graph shows you right here. So this left-hand column is the status of each arm's length sale before it was sold, and on the right you have the ownership status after the sale. And what we see is that owner-occupiers bought the lion's share of properties that were sold by other owner-occupiers, but they also bought a large minority of the properties that were sold by landlords. So owner-occupiers bought, let's see, 51% of the houses that were sold by a suburban landlord, and about 40% of the houses that were sold by a city-based or out-of-state landlord. This also shows you how out-of-state landlords acquired their properties over the last 4 years. Of all arm's length acquisitions by an out-of-state landlord, 56% of them were from, or 55%, I'm sorry, were from a city or suburban landlord, and another quarter were from a different out-of-state landlord. Just 14% were from an owner-occupier. So this pipeline of owner-occupied houses to out-of-state landlords does exist. That is a thing that happens, but it's a small fraction of the acquisitions that we've seen in the last 4 years. That's in contrast to the housing crisis period from 2005 to 2018, when houses that went into foreclosure or pre-foreclosure or were sold to, like, a we buy houses kind of predatory buyer often wound up in the hands of out-of-state investors. Now the out-of-state investors are mostly buying out other smaller landlords, usually local landlords. I want to talk about where this is happening in the city. It varies a lot, and we have seen some significant changes over time. So the leftmost map here shows the state of owner occupancy in 2005 across the city before the housing crisis began. The second graph shows that first phase I was talking about, the massive drop in owner occupancy stretching from 2005 to 2018. The losses over that period occurred everywhere in the city, but they were by far the harshest on the north side, particularly the 1st, 2nd, and 7th aldermanic districts, which each saw a 20-plus point decline in owner occupancy over that period. So that's 1 in 5 houses are exiting owner occupancy in that era. Another way to describe it is that in majority black neighborhoods, 10,000 owner-occupied properties were lost. That's 16 percentage points of the total. There was a 10-point loss in majority Hispanic neighborhoods and a 5-point loss in majority white neighborhoods. This third map shows the recovery, such as it is, that's occurred since 2018. There's been an increase in owner occupancy just about everywhere in the city. The largest proportional recovery has occurred on the east side and downtown, so that's the 3rd and 4th aldermanic districts, where the proportion of owner-occupied houses has very nearly reached what it was in 2005. There were also some pretty strong gains on the north and west sides of the city. So I want to draw your attention to the 6th, 7th, and 15th aldermanic districts, which really make up the inner core of the north side of the city. There's been about 700 combined new homeowners in the last 4 years. To be clear, that's a net increase of 700 homeowners in those aldermanic districts. And there's been an increase of about 630 in the 5th and 10th aldermanic districts, which are the western and northern fringe of the city. There's been less change on the south side, particularly the 12th aldermanic district, which is the eastern half of the near south side. There's been a tiny increase there that rounds to 0. So pretty much no change in that part of the city. In majority white neighborhoods, owner occupancy has grown by a little over 2 percentage points. It's grown by a little under 2 percentage points in majority black neighborhoods, and just a little bit over 1 percentage point in majority Hispanic or Latino neighborhoods since 2018. Last thing I want to draw your attention to here before we move on is the contrast between the 2nd aldermanic district, which is located around Havenwood State Forest on the northwest side. This is the district that Mayor Johnson represented on the Common Council. And the 14th district, which covers the neighborhood of Bayview and some surrounding areas. In 2005, owner occupancy was higher in the 2nd district than it was in the 14th by 2 percentage points. 87% of houses in the 2nd aldermanic district were owner occupied. Today, just 67% are, 13 points lower than the 14th district. These maps show where out-of-state investors have acquired properties in the last 4 years, just the north side. It's been entirely concentrated on the north side of the city. Today, out-of-state landlords own nearly 1 in 4 rentals in majority black neighborhoods. In fact, in majority white neighborhoods, the number of properties owned by an out-of-state landlord actually fell by almost 100 over the last 4 years, while in majority black neighborhoods, it grew by about 1,900. It changed basically not at all in majority Latino neighborhoods. Again, I want to talk about the 6th, 7th, and 15th aldermanic districts, that inner core of the city. Those added, as we said, about 700 new homeowners in net in the last 4 years. They added over 1,000 properties owned by out-of-state investors. So as you might guess, the concentration of this out-of-state investment in a specific part of the city, where we have also seen an increase in owner occupancy, means that would-be lower middle and working class home buyers are really directly competing for these affordable homes with a set of investors in the city. That competition is what this graph shows you. So on the x-axis, we have the net change in the number of owner-occupied properties in each of these aldermanic districts over the last 4 years. And on the y-axis, we have the net change in the number of properties owned by an out-of-state landlord. We've got this diagonal dashed line in the middle. If the dot is below that line, there have been more owner-occupied properties added than there have been out-of-state landlord properties added. If it's above the line, the reverse is true. So you can see there's this set of aldermanic districts where there's been varying degrees of an increase in owner occupancy, but really no attention from out-of-state investors at all. So in the 12th district, for example, there's been little change in either case. In the 8th district, there's been a smallish increase in owner occupancy and no interest from out-of-state investors. In the 5th district, there's been a big increase in owner occupancy and basically no interest from out-of-state investors. Contrast that with a place like the 1st district, or the 7th, or the 2nd, or the 15th, the 6th, the 9th, the 10th, where there have been big increases in both categories. So to name some specific neighborhoods where this competition is most fierce: Sherman Park, Thurston Woods, Uptown, Washington Park, St. Joe's, Harambe. These are all places where the supply of $80,000 to $120,000 houses, let's say, is being fiercely competed over by these two kinds of buyers. I think a natural question everyone always has is, how is this affecting prices? I think, of course, the increase in buying activity has to drive prices up, but it's worth pointing out that landlords continue to find the best deals in the market. So this shows you the median price paid by different kinds of transactions over the last 4 years. In this past December, when an owner-occupier bought a house from another owner-occupier, that had a median value of $200,000, up from $158,000 in 2019. When an owner-occupier bought a house from a landlord, so flipping it, so to speak, that cost a median price of $152,000 this past December versus $135,000 in 2019. And if the property was bought by a landlord, they paid a median price of $96,000 in December compared to $61,000 in 2019. The prices have increased everywhere in the city, ranging from a $30,000 median increase on the near south side in the 8th district to a $70,000 increase in the 14th district, which covers Bayview. But the largest proportional increases do come on the north side of the city: 84% increase in the 15th district, 78% in the 2nd, and so on. The last thing I want to talk about today are who the specific largest landlords in the city are, again, of just single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, and condominiums. During that first era of the housing crisis, when we had the initial increase in out-of-state investment, it was mostly sort of small-time individual investors who were putting together portfolios of a few houses up to a dozen, a couple dozen in the very largest instances. That is different than what has happened since 2018. We've seen the entrance of these 3 large private equity-backed landlords into the city. They are Highgrove Holdings, SFR3, and Vinebrook Homes. Collectively, they own nearly 1,500 properties now, up from just about 80 in 2018. Vinebrook and SFR3 focus on roughly $100,000 single-family homes, and they buy mostly north of Capitol and west of 35th. So all the green dots in this map are Vinebrook Homes, and all the blue dots are SFR3. You can see that Vinebrook is by far the largest, and that while they do have a few houses on the south side, it's really a very small number compared to their purchases on the north and northwest parts of the city. Highgrove is a little different. They focus particularly on duplexes, usually in that $50,000 to $60,000 range. And they mostly buy houses south of Capitol and between like 175 and Holton. Highgrove always puts these little metal signs above the porch on their properties. So if you go through like Washington Park or Harambe, you'll notice entire blocks where like half the houses will have one of those signs above the porch. All of these companies and others who are operating in the city frequently use package deals to buy their properties. These have really grown in popularity in the last few years. I think about 800 houses were sold this way in 2022. Now, when landlords buy properties in package deals, they usually get a price discount relative to what that house would sell for if it was listed individually on MLS. But the ability to pay cash, close very quickly, and just provide the sort of convenience of buying all the houses at once seems to make it appealing to local landlords who are getting out of the business. And so the consequence is that a lot of these acquisitions happen in a way where the purchases are occurring outside of the marketplace that would-be homeowners have access to. So would-be homebuyers aren't being beaten on price. In fact, they would probably pay slightly more for these properties, but they don't actually have the opportunity to put in an offer on the properties individually, because an individual offer is less appealing than the ability to sell that entire portfolio at once. All right, I want to end by just talking about Vinebrook specifically. Vinebrook is a real estate investment trust, which means they have to file regularly with the Securities Exchange Commission, so we know a little bit more about them than we do some of the other landlords. Vinebrook, at this point, I think is probably one of the top 10 largest single-family rental landlords in the entire country, and they were just incorporated in 2018. Vinebrook ended the third quarter of last year with 26,697 homes across the country, worth $3.6 billion. That's up from under 17,000 at the beginning of the year. So you can see how rapidly they're expanding. And when they gave the SEC that third quarter filing in November, they mentioned that they had already bought or made purchase agreements for another 3,300 homes, even after that third quarter total. This graph, which I recognize is small and you may not be able to read well, is a table I took from their latest SEC filing. It shows the markets that they're active in and the number of properties they own in each one. You can see that Milwaukee here in the middle is just a mid-sized market for them. They own about 1,000 houses in the Milwaukee market. Maybe 100 of those are in the suburbs. Their largest market is Cincinnati. That's near where they're headquartered. They've got 3,300 houses there. They've got 2,900 in Dayton. But it's these kinds of post-industrial Rust Belt cities where they've really emphasized their business model. Now, as we move into 2023, I have a few things I'll be looking for. The latest data shows that sales are way down by every type of buyer in the city, not just owner-occupiers, but also these investors. I was kind of surprised to notice, I pulled the latest data this morning, that these three private equity-backed landlords I mentioned have only bought, between the three of them, one house since the beginning of November. So something in the market, I think, has people waiting to see what will happen. The higher interest rates have certainly deterred a lot of would-be home buyers, I think. And I think this also affects the ability of the large firms to borrow as well. Based on their SEC filings, we can tell that Vinebrook, at least, is pretty heavily debt-financed, though their filings claim that, they have this ability to hedge their risk to interest rates in a way that sort of an individual, of course, wouldn't. So that's a question mark for me, is how they'll behave this year. I've also been thinking a lot about what happens if we have another wave of foreclosures. Foreclosures have really plummeted recently. There were fewer than 300 last year. There were 1,200 as recently as 2017. So if foreclosures spike again, who will be around to pick up the pieces? In the last foreclosure crisis in Milwaukee, as bad as it was, we didn't have any of these really deep-pocketed private equity-backed companies here. How would those companies respond if we had a foreclosure crisis again? All right, I'll end there. I think we have time for some Q&A.
Especially if you're in the front, too, there should be a button on your chair where you can just raise your hand and ask your question. Otherwise, we also have a mic floating around. So if you want to physically raise your hand in the back, we'll have somebody come to you.
Testing. You show these three out-of-state investor pools, but who are the largest local investor pools that are likely to surrender to the sharks?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so just to be clear, we're only talking about sort of the home rental business, not apartment buildings, because these are different players for the most part. The largest, until recently, was Curtis Hoff. You may have read a recent article about him in the Journal-Sentinel. He had a collection of LLCs, all of which began with the letter A, Anchor Properties, Aardvark Properties, et cetera. The story behind that is that it used to be that at eviction court, they called plaintiffs by alphabetical order, so that got them out of court fastest. That was the biggest one. He had hundreds of houses in the city, and he sold them all. He didn't list any of them on on MLS. He actually sold them through Facebook. It was very strange, but a lot of them in package deals, a lot of them to out-of-state investors, although not really the three we talked about here because his houses were so crappy that they weren't interested. I think the simple answer is that the largest investors that I know of have already kind of sold their portfolios, and so now they're moving on down to these landlords who own, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe a dozen at the most houses. So there aren't any like really big fish. It's this collection of like kind of smallish portfolios. There's not any like 1 or 2 names.
Other than cost, what is driving these out-of-town investors to purchase specifically in the center city?
Yeah, another great question. It's because the profits from rent are highest where home values are lowest. That might seem counterintuitive to some of you, but this is a finding that's borne out by the empirical literature regularly. The rent-to-home value ratio is pretty skewed. And if you have a large enough portfolio where you can spread the risks around, you can just make more money from rent operating in poor neighborhoods than you can in middle-class neighborhoods.
Is there any correlation between management companies and these out-of-state investors?
So the question is what's the connection between management companies and these out-of-state investors? Thanks for asking that. I should have mentioned this earlier. So the first kind of out-of-state investor in the city, the smaller kind, often individuals buying houses here, they would always contract with a local property manager to take care of that for them. And if you look at the websites of local property management companies, you'll see that they cater specifically to this kind of investor. But these 3 largest companies that have moved into the city more recently are vertically integrated. That's a key part of their business model. So they actually open up shop here and offer those services in-house.
The cool flow chart you showed with the transition of ownership, it looked like the out-of-state investors, it's actually still a pretty small part of the overall ownership mix. It doesn't look like it's changed that much. Why are we so focused on it?
Yeah, so when you compare it to owner occupancy, which in that graph it is a relatively small amount because owner occupancy is still 80 or 70% of the houses in the city, but it's a really increasingly large share of the rental market. And it's the only part of the rental market that's growing. Local and suburban landlords are shrinking pretty substantially. And so this is the only part that's growing. And in the parts of the city where that investment is concentrated, the northern sort of third of the city, I'd say, it's up to almost a quarter of the rental properties. So you're right, it's still a minority of it, but it's growing rapidly and everybody else is shrinking.
One more question?
Regarding the policy issues, understanding that homeownership decreases poverty and stabilizes families, is there any data collection around what policies we need to implement to protect and to encourage homeownership within the places where we know that, crime is growing and also rental properties are increasing? So I'm wondering, I saw in your bio that you do some policy issues as well. So is there any data collection around the policies, whether it be in the state or nationwide, that can be implemented so that our constituents and residents in the state are protected?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Teig Smith, who's over here, Teig Whaley-Smith, has a lot to say about that, more intelligently than I can. It's difficult, in Milwaukee because of our state government, which has put a lot of barriers to these kinds of policies. But when you read the filings that these companies make to their investors and things like that, it's very clear that these companies are acutely aware of the regulatory environment in every market that they enter. And so if they perceive that their feet are going to be held to the fire in terms of having to keep properties up to code and those kinds of things, they're much less likely to buy properties there. And so I think holding landlords accountable to the law is the best strategy.
Really interesting information, John. Thank you for sharing your work and continue to do the work so that we learn more. Sorry, I have something in my throat. Okay, now it is time to hear from our panel because it's great to see that there is owner occupancy growing here in Milwaukee over the past few years, but we still are far behind when we look at the foreclosure crisis that happened a few years ago. I am eager to hear from our panelists today who are thought leaders in this space and what they're seeing and what their organizations are focusing on today. So I'd like to ask these 4 people to make their way to the front. Kemp, the Vice President of Programs at Axe Housing. Elmer Moore Jr., Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority's Chief Executive Officer, WEDA. Teig Whaley-Smith, the Chief Alliance Executive of Milwaukee's Community Development Alliance, and Dorothy York, our VP President of Real Estate at Axe Housing.
So we gotta mix up the boys.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So right there next to each other.
Give me 1 second. All right, I'm going to start with you, Teig, since he kind of tipped it off to you. Give us some background on the collective affordable housing plan and how CDA is partnering with Axe to make significant increases in home ownership here in the city this year.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. Again, my name is Teig Whaley-Smith, and what really drives me is I want to make Milwaukee the best place on planet Earth, particularly for those families that have been left out of the larger social, political, and economic systems. I do that currently at a day job at a wonderful organization called the Community Development Alliance, and I see so many members of the Alliance in the audience, so good to see you, and good to see so many new faces that we hope will join the Alliance going forward. I really appreciated the comments that were made just previously on the policy side, which we can get to later, but specifically I appreciated the acknowledgement of how important housing is. Why we do housing is because it has a real impact on people's lives. You take that data that John showed, and when somebody is in unstable housing, we know that they have a 20% higher dropout rate for their kids. We know that they have 20% less employment opportunities and long-term employability. We know that crime in those neighborhoods is 20% higher, and we know that health outcomes are 18% worse. The good news is that when you invest in stable housing, all those numbers change. You have a 20% higher rate of kids staying in school, 18% higher health outcomes, 20% less crime. This is the impact that housing can have. And for years in Milwaukee, for decades in Milwaukee, and we have to remember that these problems are decades old. They're centuries old, particularly when you look at it through a racial equity lens. And this is not going to change overnight, and it's not going to change if we continue to stay in our silos. And I think this idea of predatory acquisition is a perfect example of why we need collective impact. Because to combat collective impact, it's too big of a problem for one organization to take on by themselves. It's going to take a contribution from the public sector, the private sector, philanthropy, practitioners, residents. And when you look at the resident-based plans throughout the city, those resident-based plans are screaming for home ownership. They know what the answer is in their neighborhoods, and they are screaming for an accomplice because they can't do it by themselves. And that's really what CDA strives to be, is an accomplice to the resident-based plans to live out their vision of home ownership in their own neighborhoods. And the acquisition fund that has been set up with Axe Housing is the perfect example, because part of the answer, not the entire answer, because there are great policy answers, which we can hopefully get to in Q&A, but part of the policy has to be to compete with these folks. We live in an environment where we have to compete for these units, and right now, homeowners cannot compete. Often they are offering higher prices, but their offers get rejected because they have contingencies, that they have to have an inspection, that they have to have an appraisal, and they have to have financing. And so sellers, even other homeowners, are telling them no because they can sell quick and easy. Many of us live in communities. I live in a community at Sherman Park, predominantly a community of color, and every day me and my neighbors get a solicitation to sell our home. We get a postcard, we get a phone call, or we otherwise, people are now starting to approach you when you're out with your kids and asking if you can buy your home. That's how aggressive these folks are, and so there needs to be an alternative. And that alternative is too big for one person to handle. And so that's why a partnership with Axe Housing is so critical. And what our organization does at the Community Development Alliance is we talk with John Johnson and get the data from him and other partners. And then we do intensive planning. We did a year-long planning process with residents and stakeholders and allies and funders and everybody else to say, okay, what's the answer to this? What's the first thing we can work on collectively? And the answer was an acquisition fund. And so Axe Housing reached out and said, hey, we see that we need to start acquiring homes for the homeowners we serve. I think initially they had an idea of how can we acquire 10 homes, and we said, well, how about 100, right? Because that's what it's going to take to impact this. So we went through a 6-month planning process with Axe and their staff, and Dee and Dorothy here, to develop that business plan for an acquisition fund, using the data from John to say, hey, we got to size this thing right. We have to start looking at portfolio sales. We can't just look at single sales, and that helped us size the fund. And then we had a connection with funders that are at the table. I saw Gina Stope in the audience earlier. Zilber Family Foundation was the first in to say, yeah, we've been a part of the planning process. We want to be the first in with $1 million to help Axe hire the staff to be able to do this and give you some capital. And since that point, the total fundraising goal is $11 million. The second in was Wells Fargo, which came in with $2 million for the acquisition fund. And I was part of a larger $7.5 million contribution to Milwaukee. And then came the public sector, and $1.25 million from the city, $2 million from the county, and we expect some more announcements from some philanthropic partners coming soon. We're still about $3 million short, but what that does is in a standpoint of a year, after talking with John and getting the data, through collective impact, we were able to bring everybody to the table, design the fund, have staff hired at Axe to run that fund, and hire people to start acquiring homes. And all of that was done in a year standpoint, whereas if we don't have collective impact, those things take decades or sometimes don't even happen. And I'll reserve for the larger Q&A some of the policy answers that you're looking for.
Do you talk about how this acquisition fund, how many people are we talking about this will affect in the Black and the Latino community?
Yeah, so if you take those numbers that John gave you, what does that mean for Milwaukee? What does it mean for families? And what we see after talking with residents and looking at the CESNIS data is that we believe that there are 17,000 Black and Latino families that are ready, willing, and able to buy a $125,000 home or less. 17,000 families, okay? Of those 17,000 families in the market, there are only 1,500 properties available each year. So there's only one property for every 10 plus people. And 40% of those properties are being purchased by outside investors. And so that brings the number down that available to homeowners to about 800 for the 17,000 families that are waiting to buy a home. And so what needs to happen is that we need an acquisition fund, but we also need other strategies. We've never really built single-family homes for Black and Latino families in our country, specifically in Milwaukee. So we need to take these vacant lots and turn them to entry-level homes. So it's a two-sided problem. We need to increase inventory, but the homes that have been built for homeowners should be in the hands of homeowners, right? That graph, that beautiful flow chart, that should be 100% homeowners to 100% homeowners. All of these homes were built for homeowners. The duplexes were built for homeowners. And so when you start to measure what impact can an acquisition fund have, we think that we can take 200 properties a year away from being purchased by landlords and into the hands of homeowners. It's going to take us a while to build into that, so the first goal is 100 each year. And that's how we size the fund to be able to do that, so that Axe has the capital and incredibly talented staff to go out and start making those purchases and start reversing this trend. It's really wonderful to see that curve bend up, right? That's the hardest thing to do, to change a curve. But make no mistake, right? Look at some of those districts. They lost 29% home ownership, and we grabbed 2% back, right? So let's be happy on the work that we're doing, because we are making an impact. There's a reason that 2018 is that curve, because it's organizations like Axe and their peers, those 700 homeowners that John mentioned in there. I almost guarantee you that Axe and their peers touched every single one of them. So what we're doing is working, but we've basically recovered 10% of what we had just 10 years ago.
You guys have become marathon runners instead of sprinters. I want to hear more about this acquisition fund. And Dorothy, you have been the broker for 6 years along with other duties at Axe Housing. Tell us, though, why you believe right now is the time to make such an investment in this huge endeavor of what Teig is talking about when we say 17,000 homeowners wanting to have ownership here in the city, but it's not possible because of inventory.
Sure. So at Axe Housing, our focus has always been on the family. And last year, we helped over 300 families become homeowners. Not people moving from one house to another, but people who were renting are now owners. And so it's not just moving the needle or switching out houses, but we're actually creating new homeowners, which is wonderful. You heard the information from John, right? And that says that the houses that our families need to purchase, the families we serve, 80% of them are low to moderate income. That's their sweet spot. That's their price range. The houses that are being snapped up are the ones that they need to be able to purchase because that's their price range as well. And you heard Teig talk about how they need inspection contingencies, financing contingencies, and sellers say, no, I want no roadblocks to get into closing and getting that check at the end. And so we make a promise to our families when they come to start work with Axe. Some of them have a long journey. They have to go, from fixing some debt issues or whatever, but we let them know that you do this hard work, get ready for home ownership, and we will be there with you and help you find that home for you and your family. This out-of-state investor activity has made that more difficult for us to keep that promise to our families. And so that's why this initiative was important to us, and we were already thinking about it. And then Teig made us think really, really big about it, which was a wonderful thing. But that's why it's necessary, that's why we need to do what we're doing, because we need to be in there combating or battling with these investors, making the cash offers, making the quick closings, so that our families can still win, because we will reserve those homes for home ownership instead of having them turn into rentals. Now, your question of why is this a good time to do this? So there's a couple of things. One is that we do have this collective affordable home ownership plan in place, and what that's done is helped to really explain what are the issues? What's the problem? Why do we not have more home ownership? And what kind of problems does that present for us? What do we need to solve? And it's helped to explain it to the whole city. The whole population gets to understand what is the issue so that we get more support behind what we're trying to do, which is wonderful. Right, that's part of it. The other part of it is that we are lucky enough to have a great leadership team at Axe. We had some emerging leaders who were ready to step up into new roles, which allowed me to move in to this real estate role and start to focus on how do we get these houses, how do we compete, how do we outcompete the other investors and position ourselves as investors in this space. And because of that, we were able to launch the acquisition fund and begin to purchase properties and start to make sure that we have homes available to our families. I will say Teig talked a little bit about the fundraising initiative. It's $11 million that we need. The actual fund for purchasing homes is $10 million. So we'll have a $10 million revolving fund, and so far, I think our fundraising team has done a tremendous job. So they brought in 8 of that 11 million, so we're still fundraising. So want to make sure I put that out there. We're still raising funds, but we have the funds we need to get this started, and so that's a great thing.
Awesome, awesome. Good to hear that it's moving forward, correct?
Yes.
In a good way. Well, it is clear for what you're both saying that there is a significant investment that will require to truly have the impacts you're aiming for. Elmer, this question is for you. I was blown away last year to see that WHEDA made nearly $300 million in mortgage loans across the state of Wisconsin. And that doesn't even include down payment assistance funding or tax credits or support to homeowners, coaching organizations like Axe Housing. Tell us, though, more about the housing investments you're making and the impact that they will have on low to moderate income families here in Milwaukee.
Wow.
You need me to repeat?
Yeah. That wasn't on the index card that you used. So I'm going to ask that you indulge me for just a moment.
Sure.
And I'd like to, for some of you, introduce WIDA, and for some of you, reintroduce what WIDA is, who WIDA is, and what WIDA does. So WIDA is the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. We are a quasi-agency, so we are not exactly like the Department of Health. We have a little bit of a separation. We're a cousin to, not necessarily a sibling. It allows us to operate under the benefits of our own operations. So we generally engage with the ecosystem using financial tools and products. Now, let me back up for a quick second. Our title is, or our name is the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. What do we have to do with this conversation? So we care about two extraordinary things. One is housing, and the other is economic development. And I'm going to offer to you that those things are more than related. They're overlapping. They are almost one and the same. In fact, our old strategy, or our old mission statement, was to stimulate the state's economy using a suite of economic or financial tools and resources. We believe that securing affordable, safe, stable housing is actually at the foundation of generating prosperity of every type: health, wellness, safety, comfort, and economic prosperity, to say the least. So why are we excited about this conversation? Because home ownership is one way that we can really add some fuel to the fire, generating generational wealth for families that look like mine, families that look like a lot of yours. It's the way that we can change the community. It's the way that we can engage in, quite honestly, a very high return investment opportunity. Teig talked about the implications of home ownership and community transition on crime, on education, and obviously on economic outcomes. These are high return investments that WIDA is so excited to participate in. The way that we do that is by making sure that we have mortgage products, renovation products, and down payment assistance for families who are part of the low and moderate income community. Let's put some numbers to that. What does that really look like? For here, where we are sitting right now, 50% AMI for a family of four is about $47,000. That means if they make half of the median income for a family of four, they're making $47,000. There's a lot of households like that. And when I say households, I mean places where people are living together, not necessarily homeowners or anything else. What do you think they can afford? What do you think they are choosing as their future when they look at what the market is currently? We have created a scenario in which people's ambitions are depressed, if not just suppressed. We have made it impossible for folks to engage in the long history of generational wealth creation. And so WIDA is very excited to make the kind of investments we are responsible for making to change that. What are we doing? Well, we have the African American and Latino Home Ownership Initiative. Okay. And for us, that's about understanding the true nature of the problem. So on the supply side, there is a woeful lack of available homes for people to buy, period. Add to that the number of homes that people in the low to moderate income spectrum can afford. It only exacerbates that problem. Add to that the extraordinary number of uninhabitable homes across the city that we know and love. And so we have said, hey, how do we engage in that? Second, a lot of our folks aren't qualifying for typical home financing. Add to that, a lot of our folks are uncomfortable, afraid even to walk into most of our banks, most of our financial institutions. So what do? Well, we say, hey, let's make some investments for trusted community organizations like Axe Housing. Let's give them almost $500,000 to generate home buyer counseling programs so that folks can go into their local bank confidently, knowing that they have done what they're supposed to do to be ready to make a purchase. How else do we engage? Well, we try our best to figure out ways to incentivize the production of new units. We are in a terrible time for construction. We're seeing production costs at about 30% above what they have been historically. That means to build a house, a regular, simple house, can cost $300,000, $350,000. We've been talking this entire morning about low and moderate income folks, 50%, 60%, 100% AMI folks can't afford a $350,000 mortgage. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we have to find some innovations to supplement the gap between cost of production and the cost of purchase. And we're looking to do that. There's great organizations doing exciting research. CDA obviously included, I think, of Milwaukee Community Land Trust as well, that are saying, how do we bridge the affordability gap? So the question was, what are the investments WHEDA's making? We want to understand the shape and scale of the problem. We want to put our capital at risk for learning. And we want to try a few things. The biggest change that I'm excited to offer that WHEDA is undergoing is a willingness to do things that might not work. Because if we only do what we know works, we're going to do very little and not enough. And so we're happy to be here, part of this conversation. We are members of the Community Development Alliance, and we want to be actively engaged in how do we help Milwaukee become, that was your line.
The best place on planet Earth.
There you go. So we're a state agency. I can't say that.
You can't say that. But it seems if I connect the dots that there's this concerted, collaborative effort to make sure that organizations like ACTS are supported, but most importantly, that we're creating affordable housing for those who need it here in the city of Milwaukee. But what we haven't really talked about, though, are the people.
Amen.
D, you have people who have boots on the ground, see it every day. Tell us how this will work for the people you have who are making those connections with those homeowners. What's the secret sauce?
I think it's actually already working. We at ACTS Housing, we have helped over 2,000 families get into home ownership since 1995. Over the past 2 years, we've helped over 300 families get into home ownership. So we know how to do this. I think the big difference right now is this collective action. We are in a place where we have the support of statewide organizations like WHEDA. I've been in the housing industry for over 20 years, and I've never seen the city, the state more poised to address affordable housing issues, more passionate about making sure those of us who have not been able to have home ownership opportunities in the past actually have them right now. You look at that data, and for me, it's so upsetting to see this hyper focus on depriving particularly the African American community of home ownership opportunities. So to have city officials who are stepping up and saying, no, we're not gonna allow this to happen. We're gonna make sure that if you want home ownership, there are people in places right here in the city that are gonna support you and guide you through that process. I think at ACTS, what's really helpful is that we're a one-stop shop, that you can get the credit repair, the coaching that you need, that you can get a real estate agent, that we'll help you do a renovation if traditional financing options are not available to you, or you're just really excited to put your own footprint on something and renovate it and make it you and your families. So we try to make the process easy for families, and we're definitely out there trying to make sure families know you don't have to dream about home ownership. You don't have to wish for it. If you want it, we're here, we're gonna get you there. And having the community be so responsive to that and say, I do want that. I'm gonna stop wishing, and I'm gonna work with you to do what I have to do to position me and my family for home ownership and to start building wealth. There are just too many dreams deferred in our community. One of the saddest things I hear is people to say, I dream of being a homeowner. And I tell them, let's get that knocked out so you can dream bigger. So we've got great people in this city who...
D, I want to buy a house.
Yeah.
Another house.
But we've got such great people in this city who want to see each other do well and prosper. And it's about wrapping our hands around each other and saying, hey, I know you're not an expert in this. Come and see the experts, and we're gonna take you to where you wanna go.
Awesome, I love it. So we took a few questions from the audience in order to save time, so I have chosen a few. I'm gonna start with Dorothy. The acquisition project is really exciting. Can you give us an idea, though, of the timeline between when ACTS purchases a home and when a family purchases it for owner occupancy?
Sure. So far, we've been kind of building our business plan or the business practice, putting this in practice. Our goal is a 4-month window, right? And hopefully everything goes as planned. The reason why we're perfect for this, why ACTS is perfect for this acquisition fund, is because we have that steady flow pipeline of families who are constantly getting ready. We had over 1,000 families start this journey, start their homeownership journey with ACTS in 2022. So in 2023, a lot of them are going to be ready for a house. And so we want to make sure that we're ready for them and that there's an opportunity for them to get that house, that low to moderate income priced house that they can afford. So we have a 4-month timeline from acquisition to disposition to a family. We'll see how that works.
Okay.
So far we have 5 houses in our portfolio. We've sold 1 house, and we have others working. So.
You closed recently, right?
We closed recently, yes, and the 25th of January. And so it will depend on where we get the homes from and what condition they're in and what all we have to do with them once we do acquire them. And we're making our acquisitions from a lot of the same places that anybody else does, right? Any other investor will MLS, realtors, other investors. So right now we're at the point where we're geared up to start to make larger, more investor portfolio type purchases. And so we'll keep you posted on how well we do in terms of our goal, but that is our goal.
All right, sounds great. Elmer, can you give us an insight into the flow of federal funding for housing initiatives? There's been an influx over the last years because of American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. Do you think housing will remain a top priority this year and beyond?
So who watched the State of the Union? Did you count the number of times they said housing? I counted, and I got to 0, actually. But they just didn't use the word housing.
Okay.
I promise you, when you hear the federal government, or for that matter, my boss, Governor Evers, talk about health, when you hear him talk about jobs, workforce development, when you hear him talk about economic prosperity, when you hear him talk about anything, he's talking about housing. And that's not my vanity. He's talking about housing. So yes, there's some interesting things happening. So there was housing built into the Inflation Reduction Act. There's some appropriations happening. There's a really exciting bill that we would like to support, which would allow for the use of federal tax credits to create single-family homes. If you don't understand what that means, come see me afterwards, and I'll tell you how tax credits work, at least the ones that we administer. There is interesting guidance on rezoning. There's some federal work being done. In fact, there was a recent launch of a Tenants' Bill of Rights that have a little bit of an issue with, but they are thinking about housing. I think also I would be remiss if I didn't mention a big thing. The nature of this conversation is largely around home ownership. And home ownership and housing are connected, but not identical issues. And it's really important for me to suggest to you all, by the way, WHEDA's responsibility is to think about housing. Home ownership is part of that, but we have to do things just to make sure that people have safe, stable, affordable places to live. And then we can get them interested and excited about connecting to amazing organizations who will allow them to become home buyers. But as it relates to what the federal government is doing, if they want to reduce the deficit, if they want to make sure that the mental health crisis that we're in, the fentanyl crisis, the population crisis that we're in are alleviated, they're going to support the production of, roughly 3 million new homes across the country.
Wow. Dee, have you noticed an impact with the families that you've been working with due to inflation and rising mortgage rates?
I'm glad you got that one and not me.
Right? And is it still possible for families to purchase homes in this climate?
Definitely inflation and interest rates have an impact on a family's purchase power, but our message to families is that it's never a bad time to transition from renting to owning, because you go from paying someone else's mortgage to paying yourself and investing in yourself. And while we have seen interest rates rise, they were abnormally low. So what we're telling our families is interest rates are normalizing. And this is a great time in this city to buy, particularly with all the collective action around affordable home ownership, all the down payment assistance that's available that may be gone after the ARPA funds have expired. So my message when I'm out in the community is that if you want to be a homeowner, you need to do that in the next couple of years, because the city, the state is rolling out the red carpet for home ownership. So we need to stop putting the barriers that we put in front of ourselves often. A lot of times in the community, there's that mental work that needs to be done where you know that you can accomplish this goal and you're not talking yourself out of your own blessings.
Most definitely. She is such a cheerleader. I'm like,
that.
I'm sitting here going like, what can I put aside for another house? I love it, I love it, I love it. I'm going to close with asking you this question, Teig. Okay, I think we've all heard the answer here. But how can everyday citizens who care about Milwaukee's best work with the organizations help overcome the challenges in the current housing market?
Thank you very much. And I want to take this opportunity to get to this wonderful question that was asked back here, because it's related. And so to kind of connect the dots here of what John was talking about, the data behind it, and we do need to set up the acquisition fund to compete. But what we do know is that through great policy, there can be a quality available home for everyone. How do we know this? Because we did it in the 1950s and 60s, but we didn't do it for everybody, right? And so my grandparents benefited from a VA loan that got them their first home, 1819 Winnemac Street in Madison. They built that house for $12,000 when the county median income was $6,000, right? County median income right now is $50,000. We need to figure out how to build $100,000 homes, right? Like, that's the challenge of our time. And during that time, we also saw this incredibly painful part of our history that we're still fighting against, of redlining, right? And we saw what bad policy did for people of color. So there are policy answers to this, but we have to have the political will to step up and say that predatory acquisition is the redlining of our time, and we're done with it. And here are some of the things that other communities are doing. So for example, I'll start with what the city of Milwaukee is doing. There's an incredible range of what you can do from a policy perspective that ranges for simply asking these landlords to register so we know who you are. And it sends a signal that we are watching. And if you are requiring a license to sell candy to our kids, you need a license to rent out to our kids, right? And that is a very simple proposition. And the city of Milwaukee actually did that. And they did it in 2017, right in the middle of that mountain of outside investors that John showed. And they had the foresight because they were listening to neighbors, and the neighbor says, we have these outside investors coming in. We can't show it from a data perspective, but we know it, we feel it in our bones. And the city of Milwaukee reacted and created a policy that said, you need to register with us, and you need to make sure that your property is code compliant within 90 days. A fairly middle-of-the-road strategy when it comes to these things. Very quickly, the state legislature came in and preempted that strategy and wiped that away. And so this is what we need to acknowledge in our state if we care about these issues, is that there is a state policy that basically prevents the city of Milwaukee from enacting policy. And that is the redlining of our time and what we need to address. And so I could give you all of the great examples. I could give you the California-based model where they have a tenant right to purchase, right? It's also being done in Philadelphia to say, as a landlord, if you're going to sell, at least give the tenants a chance to purchase it before you sell it to somebody else, right? So that's a model that works. You can look at Atlanta, which has incredible black home ownership. We're second worst in the nation. Atlanta's not, right? And they passed something that said, hey, if you're going to be marketing to communities, you got to make sure you're not doing it in a discriminatory or in a bullying way, right? There's lots of great policies, but it's not because of inaction of your local leaders. It's because of this dynamic that you have a state of Wisconsin that has the constitutional authority to tell cities what they can and cannot do, and they've used that authority to say you can't regulate this area, and that has to change. And so that's one of the things that we can all do so here's 3 things that anybody in this room can do depending on your circumstance. One is if you want to be connected to these policy issues, so when there is a movement and there is a city budget hearing or there is a hearing on state policy, that you're connected to that. And you can do that by going to housingplan.org and just click subscribe, right? And now you are a part of the alliance, even if you're just receiving information. So that's housingplan.org, and you click on subscribe. That gets you connected to the work that we're doing, including the work of ACTS, or if you're interested in entry-level homes, et cetera. The second is it takes financial resources to do this, right? And so we all have some connection to financial resources, whether it's through our employer, the boards that we sit on, as an individual or otherwise. And so if the acquisition fund is your thing, absolutely, talk with ACTS. If acquisition funding isn't your thing and you want to work on some other housing strategy, that's what the Alliance is here to help you do. We have incredible community partners. I see Greater Milwaukee Foundation in the room, which is an incredible partner. Their whole job as a community foundation is to work with people to find the investment that fits, and they have an incredible housing strategy and can help do that as well. So please reach out to those organizations. That would be number 2. And I'll leave you with this, particularly on the predatory acquisition. The number 1 thing you can do is when you hear these stories of people buying homes to rent out, and we hear it all the time, right? We used to hear it in hotel seminars. Now we hear it on TikTok and YouTube and otherwise. And now we hear it at the dinner table. And what you can do is you can look those folks in the eye, if you have some level of trust with them, and say the American dream is that every family can buy their own home. The American dream is not for you to buy your home and buy another home to rent out to somebody else. And you're taking a home away from a Black and Latino homeowner, because that's where the gap is. So please don't buy that home. When you sell your home, please make sure you sell it to the next generations to come forward. And that's the social change that we're going to need to see to change this problem.
Can I get a round of applause for our panelists today? Thank you so much. So eye-opening. Well, I want to make sure that we have time to hear from the man who knows the plan, Michael Gossman, who is the CEO of ACTS Housing. Thank you again for joining us. Oh, we do? Okay. Look, I was trying to...
It's space.
The mic is on the floor if you have a question.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. This has been a really wonderful event. I'm so excited about the acquisition fund and all the great work your organizations are doing. My question is, so we have this acquisition fund. We know that a lot of these properties that have been held by investors are not going to be in great shape. So what support can we offer the buyers who are moving into those homes to make sure that they're up to code and, just in better condition than they're probably coming to ACTS Housing when they're bought from these investors?
So I think I can take that one. And so a couple of things. So ACTS has been around for 26 years, and for 26 years we've been connecting families to houses, many of them that are not in great shape and need to be fixed up. And we do have a support team on board to help guide a family through the process of getting that house up to date if they were to purchase a home that needs repairs. So we have that in place, and we've always had that. The acquisition fund is a new player in the game, right? And so that's why we have that 4-month window, because if we acquire a house, we are looking at it, we've set some standards. Obviously, we want to make the house as safe as we can, so safe sanitary code compliance, that's always been our thing. That will always be our thing, so we'll make sure that those things happen to any houses that we acquire before we pass them on to a family.
Good afternoon. I'm curious, there was a mention of cross-sector collaboration and the need for that to have success. I'm wondering, what conversations or what work is being done for school-age children as it relates to buying into these concepts so foundationally they understand, what their hope should be to be a homeowner and how to avoid some of the things that are happening right now.
I can take that one. Definitely our homebuyer coaching team, we're educators and we're advocates. So education is a huge piece of what you're talking about. For us to statistically change the numbers around minority home ownership in this city, it means that our young people need to be homeowners out the gate, never renters. So absolutely, at ACTS, we always take advantage of opportunities and are looking at creating programs going into the future that really target minority young people and letting them know that home ownership is a feasible option for you. Our youngest homeowner last year was a 19-year-old African-American young woman. So I plan to make her my best friend and take her around to the schools and just put her in front of the community so that they see themselves and they know that this is a real opportunity for them to change the dynamic, not just for themselves, but their families, to start building wealth at a young age. The average homeowner in the Black community buys their first home at 40. That is not acceptable. So we've got to do the work with young people to let them know that housing opportunities are for them as well, and we need to position them with that financial education and savvy to be able to purchase at a young age.
So I'm excited to also share that we are actually co-developing a curriculum with financial literacy institutions and some community partners that literally teaches kids about financial acumen, and part of that is homeownership.
And if I could just add, there's another dimension to this, which is taking care of the people that take care of kids. And this really gets to Director Moore's comments about how these things are interrelated. We have lost 191 early child care providers during the pandemic, 191. Those are organizations, those aren't individuals, right? Sometimes they're small shops, sometimes they're bigger shops. And so as the economy has started to come back, people can't send their kids to daycare. Because we don't have enough daycare providers. And when the Next Door Foundation interviewed the people that were exiting and they asked, well, why are you leaving? They said, I can't afford my rent for the cost that I'm being paid, right? And so this is a housing issue. This is an income and this is a housing issue. So one of the pilot partners that the state of Wisconsin through the Department of Workforce Development has funded here locally is looking at housing as a workforce solution. And so what that means is that we've partnered with LISC Milwaukee and the early childhood providers to build 50 entry-level homes for early childhood education workers. And that's only the start of it, because you can start to look at the other core parts of our economy. If you look at what teachers make, they're making that $50,000 or less. They can afford only that $100,000 home. So these are the strategies of our time, is to be focusing on that, because the reality is that kids are going to look to what their parents are doing, if their parents are part of ACTS, right? And they're going to look at their teachers and their daycare workers and those folks are doing. And if you have those natural advocates to say, yes, I bought a home, here's how I did it, that starts to shift things.
So I'll throw in yes to that, right? So that amazing partnership with Workforce Development, WDC, right, so economic development, it's funny that it's going to result in the production of houses. We weren't at the table. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually great, but that just shows how interconnected all these interests are. So Governor Evers is famous for talking about connecting the dots. They are more than, they are overlapping. And so really brilliant thinking, like how do we support our early childhood educators? One of the ways we do that is by making their job more valuable. Another way is making sure they have safe, stable, affordable places to live, which, by the way, makes their job more valuable. So I love that work, and I haven't seen you to say congratulations about that WEED grant.
I have time for one more question, if there's one. Okay.
Thanks. If there was one obstacle each of you guys could remove in this super complicated ecosystem, what would it be?
Just one. I'll go first.
No way you just have one day to it.
If there was one thing I could eliminate, it's that if you looked at the chart that we got shown, the average rent that these families are paying to these out-of-state landlords, that one group, was like $1,200. If we could go to that family and say, you're paying $1,200 a month for rent, which equates to a $110,000 mortgage, you're pre-approved. Go find a house that is going to be less than what you're paying for rent right now. I love seeing creative financing. There are multiple ways to get to the same destination, and we need to be thinking creatively always about how we can help transition people who want to move from renting to owning.
I'm thinking.
Thank you for throwing out that statistic about the cost of building and how much it costs to build the house. And, you know, as we are acquiring homes for the acquisition fund, many of them have to have repairs. And so I guess if I could remove that obstacle of the cost of construction or reconstruction, that would be a benefit to us getting more houses and getting more houses ready for families to occupy.
Okay.
So this is speaking on behalf of the Alliance and the Community Development Alliance, not on behalf of ACTS or other partners. And it's an answer you might not expect, but the answer for me is structural racism. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it, right? I mean, so the reality is that no policy is race neutral. It doesn't exist. There are either policies that make the racial equity gap worse, there are ones that make the racial equity gap better, or the ones that preserve the existing racial inequities. And we have to acknowledge every policy that we pass or don't pass is leading to this result of having the second worst home ownership rates. It's leading to the homicide rates. It's leading to the unemployment. And it's going to take us decades to figure that out. Because again, it's centuries in the making, you know, of these problems, and it's going to take a long time. But the first thing we have to do is acknowledge it and just be able to say white and say black and say structural racism and say what's the racial equity impact of this policy, and be comfortable when, you know, John is showing graphs to say, yeah, this has a very different impact on black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and that's not by chance, right? Like that is the barrier. There are certainly lots of tactics to get there, but that's the primary issue.
Yeah. So at the risk of over-bureaucrating what Teig just said, I would eliminate the idea that helping is an expense, right? It's an investment. It's a high yield activity, and you know, we have a number of cliches, the rising tide lifts all boats being one of them, right? But the reality is, my life is better when I help my neighbor. And closely related to that, I spend a lot of time talking to legislators right now and helping them understand that low and moderate income communities and families are already their neighbors. Like, this is not some others. This is, you know, and I got to be careful how I say this. With some of those legislators, I'm like, it's not just people that look like me, right? It's your cousin, it's your daughter that you're so proud of, who started teaching in the school that you went to yourself, and that when we direct resources to support communities that do look like me, it will actually help communities that don't as well.
Yep.
Again, I want to thank you guys for opening our eyes and hopefully our hearts as well to the work that's being done here at ACTS. And with that, I'm going to ask that Mike Gossman come to the front.
All right. Please join me. Let's give another round of applause to our moderator, Shannon Sims, our presenter, John Johnson. The panelists who all did an amazing job, thank you. And I had a few prepared remarks that I'm not gonna follow, because what really occurred to me as I was hearing all of the panelists speak was the incredible collaboration that we have going on right now in the city of Milwaukee. And it involves government, and it involves nonprofits, and it involves for-profit businesses and philanthropists. And that is not what people talk about. Very frequently when I'm meeting with people who want to support our efforts, their perception is that nonprofits don't want to work together, that there's always competition, that it's not about solving problems. And I think in the housing space right now, you have a moment where that's really not the case, that there is this incredible energy around working together to do something great. So I'd ask as you leave here today, like, let's have that be the narrative. Like, let's talk about the incredible work that's happening, and it's not happening in silos. Sometimes it does, even within our own organizations, but so much of the great work is happening through the efforts of the panelists, the bankers, the others, the philanthropists, everyone who's here, who's participating in this ecosystem in some way. So I think that's something we can really be proud of. Thank you for coming out today. There's lots of things that you could have been doing today, and the fact that you're choosing to spend your time investing in home ownership and in affordable housing in the community is something that I want to applaud. And what I hope you're asking after what I think was a really meaningful presentation and discussion is, okay, what's next? What can I do? Well, we've got some ideas, and they're really pretty easy, at least the first steps. So the first thing that we want you to do is you all should have received in the last few minutes an email from my colleague, Jesse, that's asking you for feedback on this event. So this is our opportunity to learn from you, to learn how we can do better, and also your opportunity to raise your hand and say, there's aspects of this work that's going on that I want to get more involved in some way. So please respond to that. If you have not gotten that email, maybe it's in spam or you didn't sign up, then please talk to a member of the ACTS team and we'll make sure that we get that to you. We really respond to the feedback that we receive. So you've already given us almost 90 minutes of your time. Give us 5 more minutes and let us know your opinions on how today's event went. Speaking of the ACTS team, when we end our team meetings, we typically end them with shout outs. That's the way that we like to recognize each other for our contributions. And we are so fortunate to have an incredible team at ACTS, many of whom are here today. We actually have representatives of our real estate department, our acquisitions team, our home buyer coaching department, fundraising, lending, and marketing. All are who are in this room. So can you raise your hands if you're on the ACTS team? And we have an incredible group of volunteers, committee members and board members that are also here. Can you raise your hand so that people know who you are? So the vast majority of us are going to be hanging out for a few minutes after this event. And so this is your chance. You know, we didn't have time. We like starting on time and ending on time. We're getting getting you out of here on time. But if you have questions that you wanted to ask or you didn't want to ask in front of a big group, a lot of us are going to be remaining here, and we'd love to engage with you and continue the conversations. So fill out that feedback form, and thank you so much.